Hey there, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. I reached the edge of the industrial block just after sunrise. The streets here always felt wrong to me, even before the outbreak. I barely knew this town, and I never planned to stay longer than the few days it would take for the mechanics to fix my car. Every time I returned during these past weeks, the place looked emptier and more unfriendly. I stayed in motels, basements, and one strange apartment over a shuttered barbershop. I never slept in the same spot twice because nothing in this unfamiliar town gave me any sense of security. I moved constantly, never unpacking, never relaxing. My mother and sister might still be alive somewhere far from here, possibly in a safer region, but I had no way to reach them. Not knowing pulled at me every night, and staying on the move was the only thing that kept me from sinking into my own thoughts. I slipped through an alley behind a line of silent restaurants and storage units. Trash bags had burst open long ago, drying under the sun until they felt more like brittle fabric than anything organic. I carried a wrench I had taken from the back of an abandoned pickup. It felt awkward in my hand, because I had never been the type who worked with tools. Before the outbreak, I handled servers, lines of code, and remote updates. I did everything from a desk, rarely leaving home unless a job absolutely required me to show up in person. This town had been one of those rare cases. I had hated coming here even before the world changed. Now, walking these alleys alone, the place felt worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. The auto repair shop appeared at the end of the block. The gas station, the small market, and the car wash were all built as a single complex. I studied every window for movement, taking slow steps so my boots would not crunch loose glass or hit anything that might draw attention. I wanted only one thing: my car. I kept telling myself it would be there, waiting at the shop, because I needed that hope to keep going. The car was more than transportation. It had things locked inside that mattered to me, and having it back felt like the one step that could help me leave this unfamiliar town for good, and maybe search for my family. The shop looked intact. The windows were dusty but unbroken. The front door was still locked. That surprised me. Most places around here had been smashed apart during the riots. The gas pumps next door were torn out of their mounts. The market shelves were on the floor, but the repair shop remained closed up as if someone had defended it or lived inside after the collapse. I pressed my ear to the door and waited. I heard nothing but faint wind outside the building. The parking lot carried the smell of old gasoline. A few cars sat abandoned near the curb, all of them with broken windows or smashed headlights. I stepped toward the garage entrance and yelled out a short greeting, hoping someone might answer even though part of me knew it was a stupid idea. My voice echoed off the metal frames, and the sound traveled farther than I expected. I regretted it instantly. This area was known for wandering infected, especially in the mornings. I crouched behind a dented car door leaning against the wall. Within seconds I heard movement down the street. Not running, just that uneven shuffling that had become too familiar. I spotted one infected rounding the corner, dragging one foot along the asphalt. It wore a torn jacket and moved without purpose until it turned its head toward the noise. A second infected followed it, faster and alert. A third staggered behind them. I held my breath and stayed hidden until they passed the shop and drifted deeper into the district. The moment the last one vanished behind a delivery truck, I realized I had almost ruined everything by making noise. After waiting several minutes to make sure nothing else was coming, I stood and approached the side of the building. I checked the windows for signs of life. The inside was dark. Dust covered the counters and the waiting chairs. I needed to get in, and the front door was too exposed. The side window was the only option. I broke it with the wrench, cleaned the edges, and climbed inside as quietly as I could. I stayed crouched for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The waiting room was frozen in time. Magazines lay on the floor. A coffee cup sat on the counter, stained and dry. Nothing here had been touched in a long while, but that changed when I noticed a rolled sleeping bag near the staircase. Empty water bottles were scattered near it. Someone had stayed here after the outbreak. I looked around carefully, feeling a tightness in my chest. Whoever slept here might have run, or might have never made it out. I reached the repair bay and scanned the room. All the tools were scattered around the lifts. Some drawers were open. The place looked like someone had worked in a rush and then walked away. I moved slowly toward the lift where my crossover had been the last time I stood in this building. I stopped in front of the empty platform and stared. The car was gone. The space where it once stood still had a dark oil stain shaped in the same outline I remembered, but everything else was empty. My stomach dropped. There was never any reason for me to believe the car would still be here. The mechanics had the keys. The shop had been closed for weeks, and anyone could have taken it. Out of frustration and my own stupidity, I kicked an empty metal bucket sitting near a tire machine. The sound exploded across the shop and bounced around the walls. It felt louder than anything I had heard in days. My anger faded immediately, replaced by the kind of fear that makes thinking go quiet. I cursed myself under my breath and moved toward the stairs. I heard infected outside almost instantly, not right at the doors, but close enough. One gave out a muffled noise from somewhere near the gas station. Another answered from the direction of the market. I turned off the small flashlight I had been using and ducked behind a stack of old tires, forcing myself to stay still. The infected stayed outside, drifting along the street, drawn to the echo. I kept waiting until the noises stopped. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. It was hard to track time in the dark. I stayed motionless long after the last sound faded. My breathing steadied, and I tried to think clearly again. I stared across the shop floor while hiding behind the tires. This place was not looted. The windows were unbroken. The doors were locked. The walls were concrete. The roof seemed intact, and there was a second floor that overlooked the entire building. The car wash tunnel, which I had ignored until now, had thick walls and only 2 entrances. I ran through every place I had slept since the outbreak in my mind, and compared them to this shop. This was the first building that felt defensible. I imagined trying to secure it. I pictured reinforcing the doors, blocking the windows, and using the second floor as a sleeping area. I could scavenge food and tools from nearby neighborhoods. The shop had storage areas, bathrooms, and decent visibility from the upper windows. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. Maybe I did not find my car, but I found something else. Something that might keep me alive long enough to figure out where to go next. After the infected drifted away, I stood, stretched my legs, and walked up the stairs to the second floor office. The room was dusty, but it had a door that still latched, and a window that gave me a clear view of the street. I leaned on the wall, feeling steady for the first time in days. I wanted my car back, but anger would not change anything. Survival mattered more than sentiment. This place had promise. If I worked hard and stayed alert, I could turn the shop into a real shelter. Once the thought settled, I felt the weight of what it actually meant. I had never built anything more complicated than a flat-pack shelf, and even that leaned to the right for 3 years. I worked with online systems, servers, software patches, and remote configurations. Real tools were a different world. Everything I knew about reinforcing doors or securing windows came from whatever videos people shared online during storm seasons, plus a few episodes of survival shows I watched to distract myself while eating takeout after long workdays. Nothing in my life had prepared me for this, but I also knew that not trying was a quick way to end up dead. I needed to break the problem into small steps, the same way I handled debugging tasks. One step at a time and never assume anything will work until tested. I checked the office again with more intention. The walls were solid. The wooden door had a metal frame, and the lock still turned even though it felt loose. The window overlooked the entire property, including the lot, the gas station, and most of the road leading to the intersection. If something or someone came near the building, I would see it from here. This could be my sleeping spot, but only if I fixed the draft that came through the window edges and cleaned the room enough to avoid stepping on broken staples or dry crumbs that could make noise at the wrong moment. Someone had slept here before me. Whoever it was had left behind a dirty blanket, a torn coat, and a few wrappers. That meant they believed the room was safe enough to rest in. It gave me a small push of confidence. I opened the door, walked back into the hallway, and swept my flashlight beam across the floor. The stairwell looked vulnerable. It was open on both sides, and anyone who entered the shop could walk straight up. I would need a barrier there, something that slowed movement or blocked it completely. I did not have nails, drills, or pre-made boards. What I had were improvised parts, scrap, and whatever debris the old mechanics left behind. I forced myself not to overthink it and went downstairs. The shop floor smelled like old oil, dust, and rusted metal. I moved from station to station, not searching for anything specific, just letting my eyes track whatever looked useful. A few metal shelves stood crooked against the far wall. They were heavy and awkward, but if I laid them across the stairwell or wedged them against the steps at an angle, they could slow down anything coming up. I dragged one shelf to the foot of the stairs. The sound scraped lightly across the concrete, and I froze, listening. When nothing answered, I kept going. The shelf was too wide to lift easily, so I tipped it sideways and leaned into it until it rested halfway up the first few steps. Not secure, but good enough as a test. I returned to the bays and found a few boxes of bolts scattered across the floor. Most were too small to matter, but the boxes themselves could serve as noise traps. I tested an idea by pouring a thin layer of small bolts across the stairs behind the metal shelf. If someone or something tried to walk up quietly, the bolts would roll or click. It was simple, but simple solutions were all I had. I stood back to look at it. The shelf blocked the main access, and the bolts created a warning system. Imperfect, but for the first hour of planning, it was progress. Next, I needed to check the car wash tunnel. It was part of the same building, and if I ignored it, something could slip in through there. I moved through the workshop toward the door that led into the tunnel. I unlocked it slowly and stepped inside. The space was long, narrow, and lined with rusted sprayers and rotating bristle columns. The floor sloped gently toward a drain. The far exit had a heavy metal door meant to keep water from leaking out during operation. The hinges were stiff but looked functional. This was better than I expected. The walls were thick. The narrow shape made it harder for infected to swarm inside all at once. I pressed the interior lock on the door and pulled the handle. It's still sealed. This spot might work as a backup escape route or a controlled entry if I ever needed one. I spent the next hour exploring every inch of the building. I checked closets, cabinets, toolboxes, and storage rooms. I did not find weapons or anything close to that. I found some wrenches, screwdrivers, a bent pry bar, and a cracked pair of work gloves. I could use all of it, but none of it turned me into someone who knew what he was doing. I reminded myself that nobody knew what they were doing when this started. I doubted the mechanics here were trained for disaster survival either. They just did what seemed reasonable at the time. That was all I could do. Eventually, I reached the front waiting area again. The broken window I used to enter was still open, which meant I needed a way to seal it. I examined the frame and realized there was no easy way to repair it without boards or something solid. I looked around until I found a stack of promotional car wash signs made from thick plastic sheets. They were not perfect, but I could wedge them into the frame and hold them in place with a few metal rods used for holding bumpers during repair. I tested the idea. The signs bent slightly but stayed wedged. It was enough to keep anyone from seeing inside easily. Once that was done, I took a step back and tried to understand what living here would actually require. The shop had sinks, but no running water anymore. The market next door might still have some sealed bottles if they were not all looted. There might be canned food somewhere in the houses behind the gas station. The idea of searching those buildings felt risky, but staying alive meant taking risks. I needed water, food, cloth, batteries, and maybe something heavier to use as a tool or a weapon. I also needed a plan to store everything in one place inside the shop. I marked the office as my sleeping area, the car wash tunnel as a potential secondary escape route, and the workshop floor as the main work zone. The sun started sliding behind the buildings. I climbed back up to the office and pushed the metal shelf against the door. I sat on the floor again, looking at the dim room, the dirty blankets someone left behind, and the small window that gave me a view of the lot. I still felt unsure, but the uncertainty did not hit me the same way as before. I was afraid of this town, never denied that, but fear did not stop me from seeing opportunity. I did not know how long I could last here. Yet for the first time in weeks, I had a place that was not collapsing or burning or overrun within hours. For tonight, that was enough. I leaned back and listened for sounds outside. Nothing approached the building. The infected stayed farther down the street. I could feel myself finally settling into the idea that this could work. Not easily, not perfectly. But there was a path forward here, if I stayed patient and solved each problem step by step. I would need to scavenge at dawn. I would need to find a better weapon. I would need to keep improving the barricades. I would need to accept that the car was gone and stop letting it distract me from what mattered. I could mourn the life I had before, but only in a way that did not slow me down. When morning hit, the light came through the dusty office window and reminded me of how much work waited outside. I moved slowly down the stairs, nudged the metal shelf aside enough to slip through, and checked the workshop floor. Everything looked the same. I listened for a few seconds more, then unlatched the side entrance and stepped into the daylight. The air was cool and smelled faintly of burned plastic drifting from somewhere deeper in the city. I gripped the wrench tighter and headed toward the nearest buildings. I focused on small houses first because they were easier to check and escape if anything went wrong. Most were damaged or looted, cupboards hung open, water heaters were dented or toppled. People had grabbed whatever food they could long ago. All I found were broken plates, torn bedding, and a few packs of stale crackers that tasted awful but still counted as calories. I stayed alert while moving through each building. Every open door felt like a trap. Every shadow felt like something waiting. I checked closets with long sweeps of the wrench before stepping close and kept my ears sharp for any scraping or breathing that did not belong. The infected did not hide intentionally, but some of them collapsed behind furniture or wedged themselves in corners when their bodies weakened. One apartment on the second floor of a brick building held an infected woman crouched behind a kitchen island. I did not see her until she shifted her weight, and the sound made my hair rise. The angle saved me, because she had to pull herself up before lunging. I backed out immediately and slammed the door, then ran down the stairs, not waiting for anything else. I learned an important rule that morning: never trust silence in a building with too many blind corners. I reached the small market attached to the auto shop. The windows were intact, which gave me a strange sense of hope. Maybe someone locked it up from the inside before leaving. Maybe supplies were still there. I walked around the store twice to make sure nothing lingered near the edges. Then I pushed the door open. It did not even squeal. The place looked as if someone had swept through it with the same hunger that had hit every market during the first weeks. Shelves were empty. The freezer doors were open and dripping onto the floor. The registers were pried apart. Even the racks near the counter were stripped of anything edible, drinkable, or useful. I checked the back room and found only cardboard, broken pallets, and a few cracked soda bottles without caps. Whoever lived here before me took everything of value. I stood there for a moment, accepting that this place would not help me at all. The next target was the tall building behind the market. It had a metal fire escape stairway running up the side. I climbed it slowly, checking each landing before moving to the next. The roof was flat, covered in old gravel, and a few rusted vents. I scanned the sky and surrounding streets. No movement, no infected wandering near the block. The height made me feel less exposed. I walked toward the center of the roof and stood still for a moment, trying to picture how rainwater could be collected up here. I had no training, and everything I remembered about this kind of thing came from random posts online that I barely glanced at during normal life. I had heard people talk about dew traps or solar stills, but I never learned the right way to build them, and this did not feel like the time to experiment badly. What I did understand was that a few containers placed under the roof edge during a storm might give me something to work with. It did not rain often here, but even rare rain was better than none. I went back down, checked the gas station again, and took 2 empty plastic bins that once held windshield washer fluid. They were intact and deep enough to catch water. I carried them to the roof and arranged them under the spots where runoff looked strongest. I knew this was crude, but it was the limit of my skills. I was not a survivalist, not a prepper, and not someone who ever trained for disaster. I lived in front of screens for most of my life, but I was willing to learn as I went, and that counted for something. During the first week, the auto shop slowly changed from a cold, hollow building into something that felt lived in. I swept the workshop floor, pushing glass and bolts into piles so I would not step on them when moving fast. I dragged shelves and tool carts into better positions to create walkways I could move through quietly at night. I used old blankets from the apartment I checked earlier to pad my sleeping spot in the office. I kept a small pile of food in a corner, counting each item carefully so I did not overspend my supplies before scavenging again. Most of the canned goods I found were dented or unlabeled, which made eating them a slow gamble. A few tasted metallic, so I tossed them immediately, not willing to risk getting sick when I had no medication and nowhere to go for help. The second week felt different. The shop no longer felt empty. I had routine. I woke early, checked the street, reinforced whatever looked weak, searched a few buildings, returned before noon, and stayed inside for the rest of the day. I found an old LED strip tucked in the bottom drawer of the office desk. It was the kind that mechanics use to light the underside of cars, covered in dust but still intact. I tested it using the inverter I salvaged from the workshop toolbox. For a power source, I connected it to a car battery that still held a tiny charge. I expected nothing, but the strip flickered and then lit the whole office with a soft, even glow. It surprised me so much I almost laughed. It felt wrong to enjoy something so small, but it changed the room's atmosphere completely. It made the place look like someone lived there on purpose, not someone hiding out of desperation. Seeing that light changed something in my head. It made me take the idea of this shelter even more seriously. I cleaned the office walls, pushed the desk to the side, folded the blanket neatly even though it barely mattered, and made a small corner for my supplies. I taped one of the broken signs over the lower part of the window so my silhouette would not show at night. I moved the shelf that blocked the office door into a better position so it would jam against the floor if pushed from outside. The entire setup was still amateur work, like someone trying to imitate survival tricks from memory, but the results felt real enough to give me confidence. By the end of the second week, I walked through the shop without the same tension I had on that first night. I still checked every doorway and listened for every sound, but I no longer felt like I was trespassing in someone else's refuge. The shop was mine now because I had shaped it into something I could trust. It did not mean I was safe. Nothing in this world was safe. But I had a base, a plan, and a routine that did not fall apart after 1 or 2 nights, and that counted for more than anything I had since the outbreak took over my life. I still thought about my mother and sister whenever the nights were long. I imagined them reaching someplace stable or being taken in by a shelter that held longer than most. I forced myself to believe that possibility existed, even without proof. It was the only mental anchor I had left. If they were alive, they might be waiting somewhere, expecting me to show up one day. And if I wanted that chance, I needed to keep going, keep learning, and keep this shop running no matter how rough my lack of skills made the process. Once the basic shelter felt workable, I started noticing every uncomfortable part of the place. The nights were cold, and the temperature inside dropped more than I expected. A concrete building with no insulation and broken windows held no warmth. I slept under layers of blankets, but it barely helped. I needed a real heat source, something I could cook on, and something that would make the office feel like a living space rather than a storage closet. I kept replaying the idea in my head for a full day before deciding to check the big Walmart across the main highway. It was one of the few places I had avoided because the parking lot always felt too open. But I could not keep pretending that crackers and cold canned food would carry me through the next month. I needed a stove, something small and simple, and maybe a hatchet to collect wood from the fallen trees on the outskirts of town. I prepared for the trip the next morning. I tightened a backpack strap with a knot, grabbed the wrench I carried everywhere, and slipped through the side door once the sun rose enough to make the streets visible. I moved along the back roads, avoiding intersections where the infected liked to gather. The walk took longer than I expected, because I kept stopping to scan every corner and alley. When I reached the Walmart parking lot, I stood behind a row of dead cars and watched the building for several minutes. The front entrance was wide open, the glass shattered inward. Shopping carts lay scattered around the lot. Most were rusting in place because no one had touched them in months. I listened for movement inside, but heard only wind and the distant tapping of loose metal. I stayed low and approached the garden center entrance first. It felt safer than walking through the main store right away. The shelves in this section were empty except for a few broken pots and bags of soil torn open by animals or looters. I followed the signage until I reached the camping aisle, and to my surprise, a few items remained. Someone must have overlooked them or decided they were not worth taking. A cheap folding stove sat behind a row of plastic lanterns. The box was dusty but still sealed. Next to it, a lightweight hatchet with a chipped handle hung on a bent metal hook. I pulled both items down and set them on the floor. The aisle also had a few metal pots, dented but functional. I took one and tested the handle. It felt sturdy enough. I planned to carry everything back in the backpack, but the weight would slow me down. Then I noticed the carts again. I had avoided them at first because pushing a loud metal frame through the city sounded like a ridiculous idea. But this Walmart had plastic carts, the kind with rubber wheels that rolled quietly when they were new. I tested one and found it surprisingly silent. I lifted the stove, the pot, the hatchet, and a few smaller items into the basket. It felt strange how such a simple thing made moving supplies easier. I realized then how foolish I had been for weeks, hauling everything on my back when carts and rolling bins existed everywhere. The outbreak had not erased common sense. I had just forgotten to use it. Before leaving, I paused near the central area of the store. I looked at the empty shelves, the toppled displays, and the wide aisles that could have held an entire community if people had worked together from the start. This place could have been a fortress with proper planning: thick walls, locked doors, food storage, bathrooms, and open sightlines. But I knew I was not the first person to think that way. Hundreds of people had reached the same conclusion at the beginning, and that was why the building now looked abandoned and destroyed. Too many people in one place meant too many arguments, too many mistakes, and too many desperate choices. I dismissed the thought and reminded myself that the auto shop was quieter, smaller, and easier to control. I pushed the cart out the back entrance and took side streets home. It rattled only a little when I crossed cracked pavement. Every time it made noise, I stopped and listened, ready to ditch it if something reacted. Nothing did. I reached the shop safely, rolled the cart inside, and closed the door behind me. The sense of relief hit hard. I finally had something that resembled a real setup. A stove meant warm food. A hatchet meant I could gather wood. A cart meant I could haul more items in fewer trips. These simple tools felt like an entire upgrade to my life. Setting up the stove took more time than I expected. I needed ventilation, but I could not risk making smoke visible outside. I tried placing the stove near the window, but the smoke would exit at an angle that anyone on the street might notice. Instead, I found a cracked vent above the office door and measured it using a piece of cardboard. If I could run a small metal pipe through the vent and seal the gaps with rags and duct tape, the smoke would blend with the dust that already drifted from the ventilation shaft. The problem was finding a pipe. I searched the workshop for nearly an hour before discovering a long, thin metal tube that once held wiring for a lift. It was not meant for heat, but if I kept the fire small, it might hold. I installed everything slowly because I did not trust myself. I checked angles, airflow, and heat. I held my hand over the pipe to feel if smoke backflowed into the room. The first test filled the office with a faint burning smell, because the metal warmed unevenly, but the smoke drifted upward and out of the vent. I watched the outside carefully through the window, waiting to see if any sign appeared. Nothing visible escaped into the air. It felt like a small victory. Once heat was handled, I wanted comfort. Real comfort, not just survival convenience. I searched nearby apartments and found several couches that had cushions still in good shape. Carrying entire couches upstairs was impossible, but cushions were manageable. I stacked them in the office to make a soft corner where I could sit or even lie down without feeling the hard concrete. I also collected books, an old dartboard, and a Monopoly set because I wanted something to occupy my mind at night. There was no electricity except for the LED strip, so reading or simple games kept me grounded. It felt odd to treat a disaster zone like a temporary living room, but I needed something familiar. Without it, my thoughts drifted into darker places. On one of my scavenging runs inside a multi-story apartment building, something unexpected happened. I heard a faint meowing echoing from behind a half-open door on the 5th floor. Before I could process it, I also heard a low growl that belonged to an infected. I stepped forward carefully and pushed the door open wider. The living room was a mess of toppled furniture, broken frames, and stains that marked the early chaos of the outbreak. Near the window, an infected man crouched with his head lowered, rocking slowly. I hesitated because I was not used to confronting infected in enclosed spaces. But the meowing came again, sharp and frightened, from somewhere under a sofa. I forced myself to move. I tightened my grip on the wrench and approached the infected. It reacted with a sudden jerk, rising to its feet and staggering toward me with uneven steps. I backed up to make space, then swung the wrench across the side of its head. The sound was blunt and final. It collapsed without a second attempt, and I stepped away, breathing steadily to keep myself from shaking. The kitten crawled out from under the sofa the moment the room went silent. It was small, dirty and thin, but alive. It stared at me with wide eyes, unsure if I was safe. I crouched, reached out slowly, and waited until it chose to approach me. When it did, it pressed against my hand, trembling. Leaving it behind felt impossible. The idea of walking away from something so small and helpless made my stomach twist. I tucked the kitten inside my jacket and whispered that it would be all right, even though I was not sure of anything. I just knew it did not deserve to die alone. When I returned to the shop with the kitten, something shifted in the atmosphere. The place no longer felt like a cold shelter. It felt like a space where life existed, even in a small form. I found an old towel, shaped it into a nest near the cushions, and placed the kitten there. It curled up instantly. I sat beside it for a long time, watching its sides rise and fall. For the first time in months, the building felt genuinely warm, and it had nothing to do with the stove. The next month settled in slowly, marked by colder mornings, shorter days, and a steady feeling that winter was lining up outside the city limits, preparing to step inside. The temperature kept dropping bit by bit, and soon the occasional frost on the windows became a common sight. I stopped worrying about water because snow would replace the rain I rarely collected. Melting it on the stove worked better than I expected. The metal pot filled the room with a faint steam that reminded me of my old apartment mornings when I would boil water for tea. It helped me stay grounded, even if the world outside no longer supported ordinary routines. The cold also brought advantages. Fresh snow revealed tracks clearly, which meant knowing where people or infected traveled. The footprints of humans were usually spaced out and deliberate. The infected left messy, uneven trails that zigzagged across sidewalks and between cars. It helped me build a mental map of what areas to avoid. I learned that infected herds drifted more often near the highway ramps, while a few solitary ones circled around the old bus station. The new ability to read the ground made me feel unreasonably proud. I never cared about anything outdoors before the outbreak, but winter forced me to pay attention. The kitten grew fast. I noticed it the first time she jumped onto the office desk without struggling. Her coordination improved every week. She used to wobble and slide across the cushions. Now she ran along the windowsill as if she owned the place. I named her Lily, after my sister. I did not know if Lily the kitten was a boy or a girl, and I honestly did not care. The name fit because the real Lily had a habit of causing trouble without meaning to, and the kitten followed the same pattern. She knocked over bolts, shredded the corner of an old jacket, and once set off my improvised noise trap by kicking a handful of screws down the stairs. Living with her was exhausting, but it was never boring. The downside was noise. Her meowing echoed through the shop at random hours. Sometimes she meowed only because she wanted attention. Sometimes she saw her reflection in the window at night and reacted to it. The infected picked up sound more often because of this, which meant I needed to deal with them more frequently. I got used to checking the perimeter 3 or 4 times a day. When something wandered too close, I handled it quickly with the wrench or stayed out of sight until it moved on. The routine gave me more confidence. I did not freeze or panic the way I used to. Life in the apocalypse had unpleasant parts, but at least it replaced the gym I always hated. Carrying supplies, moving shelves, chopping wood, climbing stairs. Every task reshaped my stamina whether I liked it or not. Some problems came with solutions I did not expect. Lily needed real supplies if she was going to stay healthy, and I did not want her to rely on whatever scraps I could find. I remembered the pet store a few blocks south, sitting between a laundromat and a pharmacy. I reached it one calm morning and found the doors unlocked. Inside, most of the expensive pet toys were gone, but the heavy bags of kibble remained untouched. I pushed 2 whole carts through the aisles and filled them with food, litter, canned treats, and even a small cat house with a hanging ball attached to it. Someone had looted the electronics section and the cash registers, but nobody cared about pet supplies. It felt surreal pushing the carts back through the neighborhood, but it also felt practical. Lily settled into the new house right away and started sleeping in it more often than on the cushions. Out of curiosity, I tried one of the canned cat foods when I got home. Hunger made me reckless that day, so I scooped a bit out with my finger and tasted it. The texture alone nearly made me gag. It verified that I was not as desperate as I feared. I tossed the rest outside for stray wildlife and promised myself never to do anything that stupid again. Lily, on the other hand, loved every can I opened. I kept a strict schedule for her feeding to avoid any unnecessary noise. Food for myself became another concern. My scavenging had reached a point where apartments and houses near the shop no longer had anything good left. Canned goods were rare. The market was still empty. Anything edible within a 2-block radius had been taken long ago. The only option was hunting, something I never imagined doing in my life. There was a large park about 15 minutes away by foot. During the outbreak, I had avoided it because the open space felt too exposed, but now that I needed food, I forced myself to explore it. I found fresh tracks near the wooded areas. Squirrels, raccoons, maybe a few stray cats or dogs. The raccoons were too unpredictable for me to hunt safely, but squirrels were fast and skittish, meaning they stayed away from infected zones. They became my main source of protein. I built simple traps out of cardboard boxes held up by sticks and baited with bits of stale crackers. I waited quietly from a distance the first time, feeling ridiculous crouched behind a fallen log with a stick tied to a rope. But the trap worked. A squirrel darted into the box, and the stick dropped. I killed it cleanly, and thanked it in a quiet, awkward way, because doing this weighed on me. I had always cared about animals, but the world I lived in had no room for soft thinking. My conscience pushed back each time, but hunger pushed harder. I promised myself that I would always kill quickly and never waste meat. Raccoons were an entirely different situation. They were smarter, territorial, and willing to fight. I trapped one by accident, and the moment I stepped close, it lunged at the bars of the shopping basket I had used to confine it. I backed away immediately and decided I would never attempt that again. I released it from a distance by tipping the basket over with a long pipe. It bolted into the bushes without looking back. That incident settled the matter. I would stick to squirrels and maybe birds if I ever learned how to build something reliable for them. I accepted that hunting would never feel natural to me, but I also accepted that I did not want to die over pride or old ethics that no longer fit the world around me. By the end of the month, the auto shop felt different again. The cushions in the office made it comfortable enough to feel like a real room. The books gave me something to read every night. Monopoly pieces scattered across the desk showed how often I used it to distract myself. The stove brought warmth and real meals. Lily brought noise, trouble, and a strange sense of companionship. The more the world froze outside, the more the building felt like a small, stubborn pocket of life that I refused to give up. I began waking with a clearer head each morning and falling asleep without that constant pull of fear in my stomach. I spent the next weeks improving skills I never expected to need. I had grown tired of relying only on the wrench, so during one of my scavenging runs, I pushed deeper into the apartment complexes across the park. In one of the units that faced the courtyard, I opened a wooden cabinet and found a full set of hunting knives. They were arranged neatly on a velvet-lined board, each blade polished and sharp. Someone had taken pride in collecting them, maybe using them during camping trips or as a hobby. The apartment was empty and cold, and the bed looked untouched for months. I packed the knives in a spare backpack and brought them home, unsure if I even deserved to own something so well kept when I barely knew how to use them. Learning took time. I watched the reflection in the office window while I practiced basic movements, trying not to cut myself by accident. Lily sat on the desk during most of these sessions, staring with a bored expression as if she could not believe how slow I was. She licked her fur, flicked her tail, and occasionally swatted at the knife when I lowered it too close to her reach. I had to stop her once because she tried to grab the blade with her mouth. The whole scene looked ridiculous, but it was a reminder that life here was more complicated than just fighting infected. I had to balance survival with keeping one troublesome cat from hurting herself. Using a knife in a real confrontation still felt unnatural. I preferred the wrench because it kept distance between me and whatever I needed to put down. But the knives were lighter and easier to carry. I put one in a sheath I found under a mechanic's table and attached it to my belt, hoping I would not freeze if I ever needed to use it. Carrying it made me feel more prepared, even if I still doubted my ability to act under pressure. Life inside the shop settled into a pattern. I woke around the same time each day, fed Lily, melted snow for water, checked the perimeter, tightened weak spots in the barricades, and then went out for whatever supplies I needed. My confidence grew because I no longer felt like I was stumbling blind through every decision. Every improvement, every routine that stayed intact for another week, made me believe the shop could carry me through the entire winter. I knew things could still go wrong, but I did not expect just how fast everything could shift from stable to unpredictable. It happened in the early afternoon. Lily was asleep on top of an upturned jacket, and I was cleaning a pot near the car wash tunnel. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then, a distant hum vibrated through the air, too steady to be wind and too deep to be an animal. I straightened up and listened. Engines. More than one. I crouched behind the window near the garage entrance and waited for the sound to get closer. When it did, I pressed myself flat against the wall. A massive military truck turned onto the road, kicking up dirty snow as it accelerated. A pickup truck followed behind it, loaded with armed men standing in the back. They held rifles slung across their chests and scanned the area with fast, deliberate movements. One man leaned out the window and shouted instructions at the others, though I could not make out the words. Both vehicles rolled past the gas station, bounced through the potholes, and continued straight down the street. I did not move until the engines faded. My first thought was relief that they had not stopped. My second thought was the realization that their presence meant something was shifting in the city. I had not seen organized groups in months. The last ones were small bands of scavengers who traveled quietly, carrying backpacks instead of guns. These men looked coordinated, confident, and prepared for a fight. I had no idea what they wanted or where they were heading, but I knew their arrival would ruin the fragile balance of this quiet block. Noise in the apocalypse was a beacon. Engines would pull in the infected from several streets away. I waited at the window, hoping the herd would follow the trucks rather than approach the shop. That hope lasted only a minute. Soon I heard the distant groaning and uneven dragging that signaled movement. One infected rounded the far corner, then another, then more. Within minutes the road filled with wandering shapes drawn toward the sound of the vehicles. They did not chase the trucks because they were long gone, but infected did not think beyond the noise. They simply followed the path where sound once existed, spilling into every side street along the way. I pulled back from the window and checked every door in the shop. I made sure the metal shelf blocking the office stairwell was wedged tightly and pushed several tool cabinets against the front entrance. Lily noticed the shift in my behavior and followed me from room to room, meowing with a tone that sounded uneasy. I carried her upstairs because I did not want her darting toward a noise and giving away our position. Once she settled on the cushion pile, I covered the window slightly with a cloth to hide movement. When everything inside felt as secure as possible, I climbed the ladder to the roof access point. The air outside felt sharper and colder, but at least the wind masked the light creaking of the hatch when I pushed it open. I stepped carefully onto the rooftop gravel, crouched, and scanned the area. I did not see any people or vehicles. The only signs of disturbance were the infected below, moving slowly in clusters. I crawled toward the far edge and used my binoculars to check each direction. It took several minutes to survey the blocks around the shop. Nothing stood out. No fire, no smoke, no lights, no human silhouettes hiding behind buildings or on rooftops. Only the infected, many more than usual, dragging themselves across the road where the trucks had passed. The sight reminded me how fragile peace was here. One loud engine and my quiet corner of the city turned into a path for dozens of bodies. Seeing them reinforced why I avoided other survivors. People meant noise, and noise meant death. Even organized groups like the men in the trucks brought danger everywhere they went. I had no idea if they were friendly, hostile, or indifferent, and I did not want to find out. My life depended on staying invisible. The infected did not care who you were or what your intentions were. They only cared about sound and movement. I stayed on the roof until the wind numbed my fingers. I watched the infected spread out and slow down as they lost interest without fresh noise. None of them approached the shop directly, which reassured me. Once I felt certain the situation would not escalate further, I returned inside and secured the hatch. Lily wandered toward me the moment I entered the office, rubbing against my leg with impatient gestures. I picked her up, sat on the cushions, and tried to refocus. The peaceful routine I had built was now unstable. The city was shifting, and the presence of armed groups meant new risks I had not accounted for. My shelter was still solid, but the calm surrounding it was no longer dependable. I needed to prepare for more movement, more noise, and more unpredictable behavior from both the living and the dead. Despite all my worries, nothing happened for months. Winter lost its edge slowly, melting into a long, damp stretch of grey days, where the streets stayed half frozen in the shade and muddy in the sun. The infected moved less during the coldest nights, and it helped me adapt to a quieter world. I stored snow in plastic bins, chopped wood near the park, and avoided unnecessary trips so I did not risk running into anyone. The military trucks never returned, and I heard no engines after that day. Sometimes I wondered if they had been passing through on their way somewhere far beyond the city. Sometimes I wondered if they had died before reaching their destination. Winter made everything move slower, including thoughts. Lily grew into a completely different creature. She was no longer the small, trembling ball of bones I had brought home. She moved with confidence now, tail raised, eyes sharp. She jumped on me with so much force that I nearly lost my balance once while carrying firewood. She followed me constantly, especially when I was cooking. I talked to her more than I expected, and she responded in her own way, usually by nudging my hand with her head or pouncing on my shoelaces. Her presence filled the shop with a sense of normal life that I never thought I would have again. Spring crept into the city without any real beauty. Snow melted into puddles filled with debris. Sidewalks cracked under shifting frost. Some buildings collapsed a little more under water damage. The infected thawed faster than the world around them. They moved more often, searching for anything that made noise or smelled alive. A few got trapped in the car wash tunnel once, pushing at the metal door until I forced them back with the hatchet. They were weaker than before, their bodies degrading from months of cold, but they were still dangerous. Then came my first encounter with a living person, real, breathing, and very much out of his mind. I was returning from the tall apartment building across the street, where I had collected a few books and checked if any new animals wandered into the upper floors. I had not seen a human footprint near my block in weeks, so my guard was lower than usual. I walked through the workshop entrance with my backpack half open, thinking about whether I should melt more snow before the last piles disappeared completely. I closed the door behind me and froze. Someone else was inside. He came from the darkness between two car lifts, stumbling forward with a knife in his hand. His clothes were shredded, and he smelled like he had not washed himself since before the outbreak. His face was pale, eyes wide, and he breathed in short bursts that sounded desperate. He said something, but the words were scrambled, more noise than speech. He pointed his knife at me, then at the doorway, then at his own head. I had no way of understanding him. My instincts kicked in. I backed up toward the stairs, trying to keep the wrench between us while I figured out if he wanted help or if he was too far gone. He charged without warning. His movements were wild and uncoordinated, but the speed caught me off guard. I dodged backward and knocked over a metal tray, which sent bolts scattering across the floor. Lily hissed from somewhere above, but I did not dare look away from the man. I shouted for him to stop. He did not listen, and something in his eyes looked broken beyond repair. The moment he lunged again, I pulled the hunting knife from my belt. The blade shook in my hand. Using it on a person felt wrong even in a world where wrong things happened all the time. But if I hesitated now, he could stab me, and then Lily would be alone. He rushed forward, and I reacted without thinking. I stepped aside and slashed his arm as he passed. He screamed, spun, and collapsed onto his knees. I backed up several feet, keeping my distance. He held the wound, stared at the blood, and started sobbing. Not crying from pain, sobbing the way a person does when his mind has already fractured, and the rest of him is just trying to keep up. He dropped the knife and crawled backward until he hit one of the lifts. I wanted to say something, anything, but no words felt right. The moment I approached him, he reached out and grabbed my jacket, still pleading in that broken voice, trying to pull himself up. His nails dug into my sleeve. I reacted the only way my frightened brain allowed. I pushed him off, and when he came again, I struck him with the wrench. Once, twice, his body hit the ground hard, and the rest of the room fell silent. I stood there breathing through a tight throat, staring at the man who had once been someone's family. He might have had children or parents waiting for him somewhere. He might have been sane before hunger and fear tore him apart. I had no way of knowing. I only knew that I acted because I had no other choice. My legs trembled for several minutes. When Lily approached me cautiously and rubbed her head against my hand, I realized I had been gripping the wrench so tightly that my knuckles were stiff. I dragged the man's body outside after double-checking that he was gone. The infected would find him before long, and that thought bothered me less than it should have. I told myself he deserved dignity, but dignity was a luxury the world no longer supported. His presence inside the shop had been a worse threat than any infected I had faced so far. The experience changed something in me. I felt more alert, more aware that people were just as dangerous as any creature wandering the streets. Over the next weeks, I could not stop replaying the encounter. It pushed me to rethink my long-term plan. The shop had carried me through winter, but the world was waking up again, which meant more infected movement, more scavengers, and more desperate individuals wandering toward anything that looked intact. I started scanning the city differently. Instead of looking only for danger, I began searching for escape routes. The idea of finding a working car kept returning. I knew how absurd it sounded. Most vehicles were dead from drained batteries, missing parts, or engines ruined by months of cold. Even if a car looked intact, I had no idea how to hotwire anything. The only solution would be finding a vehicle with keys left inside. But people rarely abandoned working cars with keys in them. Still, the thought stayed with me. Leaving the city meant fewer infected, fewer hungry survivors, fewer surprises inside dark rooms. Out in the forest or the open wilderness, there might be more wildlife, more clean water, and fewer threats that moved on two legs. Nothing pushed me harder toward this idea than waking on a warm night to the sound of Lily hissing at the window. I walked over and saw two infected wandering through the parking lot. They pressed their hands against the glass of the gas station next door, smearing it with some dark mixture of dirt and melted snow. They were fresher than the ones I saw weeks earlier, meaning someone nearby had turned recently. That meant the city was still creating new infected. That meant time was running out for me to leave. Every new day made the shop feel less permanent. My supplies were still holding, and my routine still kept me steady, but the encounter with the crazed man reminded me how fragile everything was. If more survivors came through, they might not be alone. They might be armed. They might want the building, the stove, the barricades, or the food. And if they came in numbers, I would lose everything I built. The cat headbutted my chin while I was thinking one night, reminding me I was not planning only for myself. Lily depended on me. Leaving her behind would be a death sentence. Bringing her along would make travel harder, but I already knew which path I would take. The idea of her being alone in the shop made my chest tighten. So I started looking for cars again. I checked abandoned garages. I checked impound lots. I searched the smaller side streets where people might have died before they could flee. I never found keys, but I did not give up yet. I would keep searching. I needed a way out. The city had served its purpose. Now it was closing in. The longer I stayed, the more likely it became that something worse than winter or hunger or loneliness would find me. The next living person I met might not be as broken as the last one. He might be alert. He might be violent. He might have friends. When the weather warmed and the last traces of snow melted, the streets changed again. The ice that had kept infected slow began to disappear, and sounds carried differently. Water dripping from rooftops made it harder to distinguish real movement from harmless noise. The air became damp, and the wind no longer stung my fingers. It felt like a warning rather than relief, because winter had given me cover and quiet. Spring brought visibility and faster threats. My thoughts grew louder because there was no cold to push them back. I kept looking at Lily and thinking about what would happen to her if someone broke into the shop while I was gone. Every time I left her behind, my stomach tightened. I realized I could not keep doing that. I started taking her with me on my outings. It took practice, patience, and a lot of trial and error. I lined the inside of my backpack with a blanket so she would not sink to the bottom. I left a small opening at the top so she could look out when she felt comfortable. At first, she kept trying to leap out whenever she saw movement, but I trained her with slow steps, stopping each time she got restless and waiting until she settled down. After a few days, she understood the rhythm. She curled inside the pack quietly, poking her head out only when she sensed calm around us. I never imagined that I would rely on a cat for emotional steadiness, but knowing she was safe with me gave my mind enough clarity to navigate the city without constant fear. I covered more ground each week, pushing farther north into neighborhoods I had avoided during winter. The buildings became more scattered there, with wide streets and fewer places for infected to hide. Many garages stood open, their doors torn off or hanging crooked. Cars sat inside these garages like fossils, covered in dust or with flooded engines from broken pipes. Some were stripped of parts, others crushed under debris from collapsed roofs. A few looked untouched, but without keys they were nothing more than heavy shelters on wheels. Every time I searched a glove box or patted down a dead body for pockets, I hoped for a keyring. Every time I came up empty, I reminded myself that persistence was the only reason I was still alive. Then luck finally appeared, hidden in a place that looked exactly like every failed search before it. It happened on a morning with no wind. Lily was pressed against my back inside the pack, quiet and alert. I walked through a wide commercial lot behind a cluster of office buildings. At first it looked empty, except for scattered paper and a few smashed trucks. Then I noticed bloody footprints leading between 2 rows of sedans. They were fresh enough that the edges had not dried fully. My pulse quickened, not from panic but from caution. Fresh footprints meant danger. I followed them anyway because I needed answers, not guesses. They led me to a silver sedan parked crooked near a concrete barrier. The driver's door was open, and a man slumped across the front seat. His body sagged toward the pavement, one leg hanging out. I scanned the area first, checking behind every car in sight. Nothing moved. No breathing, no dragging sounds. Only the faint buzzing of a light fixture blowing in the wind from a broken window of the office building. Silence did not mean safety, but it allowed me to step closer. The man had already turned. His skin was grayish, stiff, and stretched across sharp features. A dark bullet wound marked his neck, the kind that ended everything before he ever had a chance to rise again. Whoever shot him either did it cleanly or in panic. I looked at his hands. No scratches, no bite marks. This was not an infected attack. This was human conflict, and the thought made my stomach twist. Someone else in this city had shot him, taken whatever supplies he carried, and left the body half hanging from the car. The weapon could still be nearby. The shooter could still be nearby. But then, I saw the most important detail. The man wore a jacket with deep pockets. I checked them carefully, expecting nothing. Then my fingers touched a cold piece of metal. A key. A single car key attached to a small plastic tag. I nearly dropped it from shock. I held it in my hand for a long moment, trying to understand what this meant for me. A car with a key in a city like this felt impossible. I sat in the driver's seat, pushed the corpse aside, and inserted the key into the ignition. The first turn did nothing. The second turn sputtered but didn't catch. The third turn clicked weakly. For a moment I thought I had imagined all of this, that the engine was dead, and the key was nothing but a false promise. Then I tried a fourth and a fifth time. The engine coughed, rattled, and finally started. The vibration traveled through the seat and into my spine. Lily crawled higher in the backpack, startled but calm once the sound settled. The fuel gauge hovered under half a tank. The battery looked old but not dying. The sedan was simple, automatic, and reliable enough to carry me away from the city if nothing went wrong. I turned the engine off and sat there with my hands on the wheel. I stared through the cracked windshield at the horizon and felt a shift inside me. The shop had kept me alive for months, but the city had given me nothing else to hold on to. No human connection, no real clues about my mother or sister, no reason to stay. I still loved them, and part of me imagined them alive somewhere. But with each passing day, my belief in finding them dimmed. The world had scattered everyone without warning. Survival did not follow the rules of hope. Still, I wanted to try. I wanted at least one attempt to find new ground, new places, maybe even new life. The sedan was my last chance to make that decision instead of having it forced onto me by strangers or the infected. I closed the door quietly, checked the surroundings again, and made a plan in my head. I would return to the shop, gather only what mattered: food, water, blankets, fire-starting tools, knives, the stove if it fit, and everything Lily needed. I would not try to take everything I owned. Weight slowed movement. Movement meant survival. The city had started breathing differently, and I did not want to be inside it when danger exhaled again. The walk back felt longer than usual because my thoughts kept racing ahead. I imagined the route I would take to leave the city. I pictured the roads I had memorized months ago, the bridges, the long curves where infected sometimes gathered. I tried to picture the open fields beyond the suburbs. I tried to imagine a forest with clean streams and wildlife instead of abandoned storefronts and broken alarms. The road would have risks, fuel shortages, and tight moments I could not predict. But staying put had become a slow death. Leaving at least gave me direction. When I entered the shop, Lily jumped out of the backpack and ran toward her cushion corner. She rolled onto her back, stretching her legs, unaware of how close our lives were to changing again. I watched her for a moment, then looked around the office, the workshop, the tunnel, the shelves, and the stove. Everything here held pieces of the person I had become since the outbreak. Resourceful, stubborn, more capable than the timid man who first broke the side window to get inside. I walked from room to room, deciding what stayed and what came with me. Some things were easy to leave behind. Others felt like part of my identity now. But I reminded myself that nothing inside these walls would matter if I died here. I needed to move as soon as possible. The sedan would not last forever. Fuel stations rarely had working pumps, and the car had half a tank at best. I would need to ration every mile. By late afternoon, I had a pile of supplies ready to load into the sedan. I checked each item twice. I prepared Lily's travel bag. I stood in the center of the workshop and breathed in the stale air for what might be the last time. This building had protected me during the harshest months, but it was no longer a long-term refuge. It had become a chapter, not a destination. When night fell, I sat beside Lily and whispered a quiet promise to drive at sunrise. Not because the road was safe, but because staying was no longer an option. Tomorrow, I would leave the city behind. Tomorrow, I would see if the world still held a place for people like us. And if there was no place, then at least I would face that truth while moving forward instead of waiting for the city to swallow me. With that thought, I lay down on the cushions for the final night in the shop, listening to the faint sounds outside. The future was uncertain, but the engine of the sedan had already given me an answer. Move, before the world makes the choice for you. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you. What moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership: Carlos Herrera, Dominique Johnson, The Great Anywho, Jadala, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell, William Blackwell, TJR. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.